Hey, hi, hello. I'm super excited to finally be making this video. I've wanted to for a long time. To begin with, if you don't know who I am, my name's Avery, and I graduated from a seminary back in 2019, which means that I had the money and time and resources to spend 3 years at a school where really smart people taught me uh, tons of things, including the biblical Hebrew and Greek languages and sort of how to be a Bible scholar and all of that, which is like my favorite thing in the world. But I know that the vast majority of people don't have the time and the money and all the other resources they need to get that kind of education. And so I want to sort of make this video with people who don't know biblical Hebrew and Greek in mind. People on a whole array of like either you don't know any languages but your native one, you know a lot of grammar, you hate grammar, all of it. There's something in here, I hope, for everybody to learn how to use some cool tools that are free online. The tools that I'm gonna take you through today, I chose the ones I did because they're not all like the best out there, but they're free, and so anyone with internet access can make use of them. And yeah, they're not as good as some other things out there, but they will do in a pinch. They'll do pretty much the same things as the stuff you pay money for. Sometimes you just have to do some like roundabout stuff to make it to do what you want to do. But it's all there for free for anyone who knows how to use it. If you don't know Greek and you have no intention of learning Greek or Hebrew, you can still look at what the Bible says outside of an English translation, right? You can look at some of the original manuscripts of Greek and Hebrew that the Bible was written down many years ago, right? Which is so important. I think it's so important that the average person without a fancy degree like mine is able to look at the biblical languages for themselves, so that you don't have to rely on people in power to tell you what the Bible says. So that's why I'm doing this. This video will be the first of, I imagine, at least a few videos where I show off some of these resources, and this one will be the most basic. So there will be a later one where I kind of go through some grammar stuff that might be more complicated for some folks, but this one is literally like the most basic stuff I can think of for when you are reading something in your English Bible or any language. I'm saying English for this just because I'm speaking in English, so I imagine most people watching this will be using, know English and all of that. So you're sitting with your English Bible and you read something that you're like, that seems strange or like kind of confusing. I wonder what the Greek actually says there, or the Hebrew. I wonder what it was in the sort of original language. So that's what these tools are going to let you do, at least a little bit. You won't be able to go as deeply in depth as if you knew Hebrew yourself, but you will be able to do some basics that really will help you. So let's get started. I'm gonna take away my beautiful face and show you my screen. Okay, so we're gonna start with I'll say friend, BibleHub.com, and they're trying to autofill things, and I don't want that. I just want as if you just went straight to BibleHub.com. And one thing I want to open with is letting you know that just because I use this tool doesn't mean I necessarily agree with whoever produces this tool, what their beliefs about scripture or theology happen to be. I do appreciate that they say they wish to encourage everybody, regardless of belief system, to use this site. So, I use it, and again, so if there's viewpoints that the makers of this site hold, that just know that that doesn't mean I hold them. And for all of the tools that I could offer you, I want you to know that like part of learning how to do this stuff and look at the biblical languages and stuff on your own is so that you don't have to take anyone else's interpretations as the one right interpretation, right? So just starting with that. Sorry for that spiel to begin with. When you go to BibleHub.com, you can go to a Bible passage, and I've decided for this that I'm going to go with Genesis 4. So the story of Cain and Abel is what I'm going to use today as our example passage. And it immediately opens me to the Berean Study Bible. I don't really know anything about the Berean Study Bible, but if you have a Bible version that you prefer, you've got them up here. NIV. And another sign that makes me nervous is they start with these. I'm not a fan of these translations. They tend to sort of go quite far away from the original language, and their interpretation tends to lean more conservative. KJV is important. New King James, okay. My seminary friends would judge me. I like the New King James Bible. It's closer to the original languages than some other options, so I'm a fan. I like New American Standard because it's what I grew up with as a Catholic. Where is it? For me, though, my favorite option that this site has is I'll use the NKJV a lot, and I also like the CEV, Contemporary English, also called CEB, a lot. That's more progressive. The people who made it were more sort of progressive, and it's made to be easy for folks to read, like it's, modern English and all of that. My other translation that my seminary was a big fan of is the NRSV, and one issue with Bible Hub is that they do not have the New Revised Standard Version. So I've got my Cain and Abel story, and I'm reading it. I don't know this, but pretend I like Berean Study Bible. I don't know. Maybe I do. And Adam had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. So we started with that. And she says, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man, she said. And, well, that doesn't make sense to me without footnotes if I don't know that the word Cain in Hebrew sort of has this idea. Let's see if they say it here. Here we go. So they have a footnote that says Cain sounds like the Hebrew word for acquired or brought forth. So it helps explain that. Just some basics. You can also do this fun thing where you parallel. Let me do that again in case you missed it. Right here. This short, parallel chapter. So I want to look at Genesis 4, not only in the Berean Study Bible version, but also a different version. And up here I can choose. So BSB, parallel to the Hebrew itself. Yay! So that's one option. And also what you can do is if, say, you want to see what the BSB has compared to, well, I'll do the KJV. That's also a good one. So we have a little bit different translation. So we've got Berean versus King James, what these two different, whoever made this Bible versus whoever made this Bible had different ideas of how to translate the Hebrew. And so some of it is very similar. Some of it might end up quite different. So like a small difference, Cain was a tiller of the soil versus Cain was a tiller of the ground. Those aren't that different. That's okay, ground versus soil. But some of them might be quite different. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, versus, and the Lord had respect unto Abel, but he had no regard for Cain and his offering. So from favor to regard in the same translation, versus, but unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth. You could tell this one's older, right? And his countenance fell, versus the more modern-y English, so Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. And I think these two verses are where I want to do my first sort of more in-depth study, where I want to know why, what on earth does this mean? And that God had no regard for Cain and did have, looked with favor on Abel, but had no regard for Cain, or what does to have respect or not have respect? What exactly does that mean? Because those are a bit different, favor versus respect in our contemporary connotations of those English words, they're rather different. And so this is where I want to do my first sort of in-depth word study is what is going on with this wording. And so Genesis chapter 4, verse 4, and as well as verse 5 that we'll get to. So here, I'll show you what I usually do because I haven't taken the time before to really figure out. What I normally do is I just Google Genesis 4 verse 4 when I want to do what I'm about to do, which is, it's highlighted, but what I do is I find So I find the first Bible Hub one that just shows, instead of saying it's a certain version, so see how there's NIV versus KJV, I want the web page that shows all the different versions of this verse. So it shows the NIV, NLT, ESV. It shows many different translations so that I can look at all of them and see what all these different English translations decided upon. But I want to figure out if there's like a much less roundabout way to do that. There has to be, right? Wait, that was so easy. Y'all, okay, so while I'm on this page, or say I'm not doing the parallel thing, but I'm just doing, so get out of the parallel, and I'm just doing, I'm just looking at, I can do it here too, where I just click on the verse, and then boom, it shows me all the different English versions they have available. And again, like I said, one that they don't have is the NRSV, which I really like. Let's see what happens if I click additional. Will they then have revised? No, they still don't. That's not the new revised. So they have all these different versions. They don't have my favorite, so I would probably Google, like, in fact, yeah, I'll do that. Genesis 4:4 NRSV. Cain murders Abel. Yep, we know. So, and the Lord, so what it says in verse 4 is, and the Lord had regard for Abel, so it's that word regard that we saw, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So we have this idea that probably in the Hebrew this is going to be the same verb base, because in the English they're the same. Even though when we were looking at the BSB, it had two different, it said, looked with favor, and then the second one was no regard. So that was a bit tricky on the BSB's part, where if I just looked at the English, I would think that what God is doing with Abel, the favor thing, is a different verb for what God was doing with Cain, which is to have no regard. Whereas just from looking at all the English ones together, we can guess, and don't worry, we're going to get to the Hebrew in a moment, but we could guess that it's going to be the same Hebrew verb. But let's look at what we're doing right now is just comparing all the different English. So we've got with favor, had respect, looks to Abel, and this is one of the more literal, looketh unto Abel, look to Abel. So the literals tends to be, like it says, very literal. So now I might guess that the verb in the Hebrew is going to be as simple as look instead of favor or regard or respect. And yeah, so NLT has accepted, that God accepted the offering. More respect, more regard, more favor. You get the picture. Okay, so we've looked at all these different options in English. Finally, we want to look at the Hebrew, right? So this is where I'm headed, interlinear. And now we're gonna be on Genesis 4:4 with the English and the Hebrew. It's called interlinear because the lines are interwoven, right? So let me show you again in case you missed it. Whether I'm on this page or back on this page where it shows the whole Genesis translation, it's always up here on this toolbar, interlin, short for interlinear, and that's where I want to go. And since I clicked it from when I was just looking at the whole page, it starts with verse 1. If you want to, you can click here for the full chapter, which is what I usually like to work with. You can either look at if seeing all of this is really overwhelming and you're only trying to look at one verse, I recommend just selecting the single verse, like we had the option in a moment ago. But for me, I like to see it all, and part of that, I know Hebrew, so it's not as overwhelming for me, so it's totally up to you. And what you'll notice here is that the interlinear, what it does is it preserves the word order of the Hebrew, which means that the word order of the English looks real weird. And Abel brought also he. Quick, very important thing. Hebrew, if you didn't know, English goes left to right, correct? So this is where we start our I. Adam made love. Oh, love that. Made love. Okay. And we go towards the right, and then we go to the next line, and we go towards the right. In Hebrew, it's the opposite, where the name Adam would start here. Adam made love. So it would goes to the left, go back to the right side. goes to the left, like that. And that's important to know when you're looking at the interlinear, that you should start up here. See verse 1, the number's here on the right side instead of on the left like in English. And Adam knew Eve, his wife. Also notice this in Hebrew, it's way more sort of vague, ambiguous, right? It's a euphemism, right? Adam knew his wife is indeed the sort of biblical, polite way of saying had sex with, made love with, however you want to word that, had relations with. In Hebrew, it's just, and he knew her. But anyway, now that we know that about the Hebrew, that it goes right to left, and Abel brought also he of the firstborn of his flock. See how it, in the English, this is why if you don't know Hebrew and this is like, what is this saying? It's good to keep that English up so that you can kind of compare the two, right? But it's good, it's nice to have the Hebrew in the correct order, because then you can sort of notice things about syntax, the what the word order signifies, why it's ordered the way it is, sometimes matters. I'm not going to get into that for this video. That'll be a later video focusing in on grammar and syntax, but that's why we like this interlinear page, or I do. I don't know why I'm using royal we here, or saying that you must like it too. But anyway, what did we want to focus in on? This verse. So we look around for where what we were looking for was the whole, and looked with regards for, respected, looked favorably is what this one says it is. So what we're going to do is we want to click on this number here. Kind of looks like, if you don't know what it is, you're like, why is that number there? That means nothing to me. Well, click on it. What that does is it takes you to Strong's Hebrew dictionary. Is it's a good Hebrew tool, but basically it's taking you to the root of the verb. In this case, sha'ah is the verb, which means it shows you first in Strong's Concordance, most basic, it means to gaze. And see, so this is the Hebrew word. If you don't know Hebrew letters, you have no clue how to pronounce that. But it lets you know transliteration in English, what it might look like. Sha'ah. Sha'ah. Sha'ah is how you would write it, like this, and then really helping you phonetically sound it out, sha'ah. And it means to gaze. But, of course, so they're telling us, like, this is the most basic, gaze. Whereas in the Hebrew, it's the specific, it's been conjugated, and if you don't know grammar, that word might not mean a lot to you. I'm going backwards so we can look at it again. See how it looks way different here. Va yasha. So it looks quite different, but it has this root. Just like how in English, I am, you are. Am and are sound like completely different verbs, right? But they both have the same meaning of to be, correct? That's what we're looking at here. So Strong's Concordance tells us what this, and the number strong assigned to this verb is this one. That's why that was the link to find this dictionary page, basically. And so yeah, we have the most basic idea of gaze. I really like, if you keep scrolling, you found Brown-Drivers-Briggs. They're a dictionary. These are the last names of 3 people who made a dictionary together for Hebrew, and they tend to have even more information. Gaze steadily with interest, etc. In fact, I have a copy, like a physical copy of Brown-Drivers-Briggs, and it is enormous. So just be happy it's a dictionary. Like, you can look at it online, so you don't have to pay the big bucks for it, and you don't have to have this enormous volume clogging up your bookshelf. Let me tell you, this is so much nicer. But yeah, so it tells you a little bit more what kind of gazing steadily with interest. And it even tells you, this is more than most of you will probably ever need to know, but originally sha'ah, before it was a Hebrew term thousands of years ago, it comes from an Assyrian word. So the Semitic language family is what that's all about. If you don't care about word origins like that, then that most likely will rarely have any meaning for you. But yeah, so it's telling you what the verb means. Okay, so most literally, that means that when we're looking at the Lord looked with favor on Abel, it really is like, and God looked upon Abel, but did not look upon Cain, right? Like most generally, it's about just looking at someone, gazing. So Why do some English translations say that what it says is that God looked with favor on, or even God accepted Abel's offering but did not accept Cain's offering? What does that have to do with gazing? Well, one way they sort of decide how to translate that is to look at all the different instances of this word throughout the Hebrew Bible, so throughout the Old Testament, this long list. And for all of them, you click on the 15 occurrences, and now what the page is showing you is all of them. All the times this word is used throughout the Bible in Hebrew. So, yeah, we see that there's only 15 occurrences of this word in its various forms in the entire Hebrew Bible, which isn't super rare, but it's also not super common. So, if you wanted, you could sort of look through every single usage, and it wouldn't take you too long. Don't worry, I won't look at every single one, just the first couple. So we see that the first examples in the Hebrew Bible are our two verses. I'm going to look at Exodus 5:9. And you can see that, like, this is showing you just a little clip, a clip that doesn't make a ton of sense by itself, so you would probably want to get the whole context by searching. And it takes you to this kind of weird chart that really pulls apart the Hebrew, which it's a little confusing to look at, so you might want to choose a Bible. I'll do the NKJV, and it takes you to Exodus 5. So we scroll to verse 9, and see now we can see the whole context of what's going on, that Pharaoh is telling his overseers to make the enslaved Hebrews work even harder so that they won't have time to listen to Moses, is like the context going on here. If you read the whole chapter, you would see. And so this verse says, "Let more work be laid on the men, that they may labor in it, and let them not regard false words." So this is the verb we're looking for, right? This regard, gaze upon false words. So basically, keep them so busy they don't have time to pay attention to Moses's lies. And again, if NKJV doesn't make a lot of sense to you, you can then choose some different Bible options, right, to kind of really get the gist of what it's saying. So that's Exodus 5, this idea of, so they're using this verb gaze to say, let them not pay attention, right, regard, so on. Then in 2 Samuel, we've got, they looked, but there is none to save. And I won't bore you by going here, but basically, yeah, so it's explaining how the people are like frantically searching for someone to help them, and there's no one there. So pretty basic. Like they looked around, they gazed, right? So to look intently. Then in Job, we have a couple of, and again, I won't bore you, but you could go to see the full context of the chapter. Job is basically saying, like, will you never turn your gaze away from me, God? Basically, like, God, I need a break from your, like, constant staring at me. Basically saying, like, please stop paying attention to me for 1 second. So, yeah, basically, we're just looking at all these different, so here it's just, they don't look to the Holy One. And then just questioning, what does it mean to look to the Holy One? Is it just a literal looking, like face to face looking at? As you look at the different contexts and do your own study, you might decide that it means sort of more like look upon, to pay attention to, or respect. Like, so you could have this idea. Once I've done my search, I think what I sort of would conclude is that this gaze word does indeed have the sort of most basic meaning of to look at someone intently, or to sort of take that into to sort of apply what that means to look at someone intently, to pay attention to them, right? So in our context of Genesis 4, what is the issue here? What is God doing and not doing that gets Cain so upset? I think we could word it as simply as look upon, or we could interpret it as basically, and God paid attention to Abel and Abel's offering, but did not pay attention to Cain and Cain's offering, and that's what gets Cain upset. I think a lot of interpretations have they add this idea of what kind of looking on with favor, did not accept Cain. But I think something like, if I were going to do a sort of modern metaphor for what's going on here, I might imagine, say, you're a child with a sibling, and you and your sibling both make a drawing, both draw a picture, and you both show your parents that picture, and your parents are gushing over your sibling's picture, and they don't they barely glance at your picture, right? They don't even say anything about it. It's not that they're saying something negative, right? They're gushing over your sibling's picture, and then yours they tear up and throw away and say, wow, that was garbage. Instead, I'm getting more the idea of they just don't pay any attention to it all, right? So I would kind of, for my own interpretation, and again, you might have a different opinion after you do your own word study, but I think that it's sort of the translators who decide that God's sort of saying, right, that God did not accept, basically like adding this flavor of God didn't like Cain's gift and like said something negative about it. I would say, no, in my interpretation, it's more that God just isn't paying attention to Cain's gift at all. And that's what gets Cain upset. Um, so, yeah, that's what I find in the Hebrew. And then I might decide sort of which English translation has that same flavor that I'm thinking of. And I might also consider why other versions have a different flavor going on. If that makes sense, maybe let me know if that doesn't make sense. But that's kind of what we're doing here, right? And why, and then you would apply sort of after you do your word study, think about why does it matter? How does it affect the overall story if Cain is upset that God says something negative, like flat out doesn't accept the offering, versus God just sort of ignoring the offering, not doing anything about it? How does that affect the overall story or any themes? And so that's sort of why we do this work, is to look at that bigger picture and why it matters. Okay, so we've looked at one example of doing like a really brief word study type thing. I want to do one more example of looking into deeper into the Hebrew of a single word for this video. So let's see, what's a good one? How about this one? This famous line, right? Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He, so Cain, said, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" That's how it's traditionally translated. So let's go and let's see if that is, what verse was that? Verse 9. Let's see if how other English versions translate that word keeper. I imagine a lot are going to stick to keeper because that is so ingrained. The idea of being my brother's keeper is so ingrained in sort of that's how we expect it to go. That's one of those verses or phrases that has sort of taken on a life of its own even beyond the Bible and referencing Cain and Abel. So I was right. Most of them say keeper, but look, the NLT instead chose guardian. Am I my brother's guardian? So we've got keeper, guardian, keeper. Oh wow, and this one just said, am I supposed to look after my brother? Yeah, it's kind of nice to look at that and think, what even does what would it mean to be your brother's keeper? What does that mean in English? Or your brother's guardian. What does that mean in English, especially with contemporary connotations? When I hear the word guardian, I think of someone acting in the role of a parent, right? If I'm someone's guardian, that means I adopted them as my child, probably, or am looking after them as if they were my own child. So I'm their guardian. And that could be a sibling, right? That, I think of in Lilo and Stitch, that Nani, the older sister, is the guardian to Lilo. But often, usually it's often not a sibling person. And it would be weird, right, for Cain to be his brother's guardian. In our modern viewpoints, if Adam and Eve are still alive, the parents, why would Abel need Cain to be his guardian? So that's one reason I might personally throw out the option guardian, because it gives us all these ideas in our modern culture about what a guardian is that I don't think the Bible is what the Hebrew is trying to say. What about keeper? I think keeper is a fairly good option because it's pretty ambiguous in English too. What would it mean to be your brother's keeper? I don't know. That's one where I'm like, well, if I think of someone keeping someone else, I'm thinking like a zookeeper, right? Like if I'm the keeper of an animal, I'm like their zookeeper, right? Another option might be like, if I'm keeping someone, I would almost think like a prison guard, right? Like I'm keeping you under lock and key. So I think because my brother's keeper is so ingrained in like our cultural psyche, it's okay. If it weren't such a popular verse, I probably would advocate for changing from keeper to something else, unless it is supposed to mean someone guarding someone in a jail, or it's supposed to mean like a legal guardian. Maybe the Hebrew is supposed to mean that. We haven't looked yet. So let's get looking at the Hebrew. So we're back to our interlinear, and we're scrolling down, verse 8, verse 9. And said, blah, 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 where's your brother? And he said, I do not know. Keeper, here it is. And so in the Hebrew, we also see it's a little backwards from our English word order, right? The keeper of my brother, I, instead of am I my brother's keeper? But that's just how Hebrew word order typically works. But if you remember what we do here, we find the word keeper that we wanted to look at, and we click the number that will take us to Strong's Concordance. That's all that number stands for, right? So they're telling us that the root of this word that's getting used is, interestingly enough, a verb. Shamar is a verb, and so again, it looks like this in the Hebrew. You write it in English letters as shamar, and then if you want to know how to pronounce it without knowing Hebrew, shamar. And by the way, this is the stress, so it's not shamar, it's shamar, is what that helps you figure out. And it means to keep, to watch, to preserve. So keeper works, but you might be like, hey, isn't that my brother's keeper? If I know anything about grammar, I would say that's a noun, whereas the Hebrew, it's a verb. So you backtrack, and you look back at keeper here, and it turns out, and this is what we'll dive more into in a future video, is looking at this stuff down here that tells you stuff about the grammar. What we find here is that indeed it comes from a Hebrew verb. It says verb and participle. If you know about participles in English, it's when you take a verb and it stands in place of a noun. So for a more literal way of translating this, instead of the keeper, might be the keeping one. The one who keeps, the keeping one. And because when you hear keeping, you think, oh yeah, that sounds like a verb. Whereas when you hear keeper, you're like, no, that's pretty much a noun, right? So just a little thing to know about grammar, but we'll get more into grammar stuff next time. But yeah, anyway, that's where the word keeper from my brother's keeper comes from, is shamar. And you will find, I'm going to scroll down, scroll down to 469 occurrences. That's how many times this verb in some form or another shows up in the Hebrew Bible. Compared to the 15 occurrences of that word for gaze upon, right? That only had 15 uses in the whole Hebrew Bible. Shamar is one of the more common words in the Hebrew Bible, with 469 uses. That's a lot. And looking at what some of those uses are, like we saw before, can help us figure out a little bit more what it means in our own verse. I jumped ahead a little bit because I wanted to show you just how common this word is. We can look, before we really dig into different uses throughout the Bible, just kind of looking at the basic definitions. Again, I really like Brown-Drivers-Briggs for this a lot. It's telling you sort of some stuff about where it came from, or other uses. It's showing you some more specific, so in general, it means to keep or preserve, and then here's some examples. Keep, have charge of a garden, and so we'll see it sort of goes through specific ways that it's used. And wow, look, it really can mean someone who's being kept watch over, might be a prisoner, like I kind of mentioned before. Are we talking about Cain as a prisoner to Abel? It can be, but you see, there's not as many. It's in Joshua, 1 Kings, Genesis. Oh wow, so they are made. Oh, Genesis 3. That's not our passage, but so there's not that many where it sort of has that almost like imprisonment vibe to it, according to scholars who claim that they don't see these other ones as being that vibe. But again, this is all interpretation, right? Maybe you want to make the argument that in the Cain and Abel story, it is saying, am I my brother's prison warden, that I would know where he is all the time, God? I guess that's one way you could interpret it. But of course, more often, I think we like to interpret it as almost like, am I my brother's caregiver? Guardian could work, someone that takes care of him, right? And again, like, it's hard to find a word in English that doesn't have a lot of connotations for us, like I said about what guardian brings to mind for me. Caretaker has a similar thing where if I hear that a human has a caretaker, I'm going to think that they have a disability, an illness, or they're elderly, and therefore they need someone taking care of them in a sort of specific kind of way, right? Um, so that's kind of interesting. What about when we hit somewhere like Genesis 17, where it's not a person being kept, right, but a covenant? So God's saying to Abraham here, and if you want to know the full thing, you'd have to look at the full verse or chapter, right? But I just remember that this is God saying to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant. And so, and that's what this verb means a lot. One reason it's so common is because throughout the Bible, of course, there's a lot of talk about keeping commandments, keeping covenants, right? And so we'd want to think about what does keep mean there? Like, does it mean just the basic, like, I'm keeping it because I have to, like it's just an obligation? Or is it keep as in like cherish? Like, I want to preserve these commandments because I really respect them, and it's something I want to do instead of just an obligation. So, as you explore the different ways keep is used, for instance, Genesis 30, it's used for a shepherd keeping their flock. Again, is that just a job? Like, oh, I just have to keep watch over these sheep, or is it like, these are my sheep, I care about them, I want to keep watch over them? I don't know if that makes sense to you, but just sort of like the nuances is something that you would want to explore as you try to figure out what it means to be your brother's keeper, right? What does it mean to keep a person? What else gets kept in the Bible? Things like that. It has so many different meanings that it can be hard to get more precise. And how you choose to interpret it, change or translate it, really changes how you read the full story, right? Alrighty, so we have already done a lot in this video, spent a long time, but I want to do one more thing, which is to show you my one other, like my favorite basic tool for studying the Bible with free resources online, and that is lumina.bible.org. It's also called NetBible, so you can also just type in netbible.org, and what it is a lot of the tools that Bible Hub has, just in a different place, just organized differently. You could choose to only ever use this netbible.org, and you'd be good. So I want to just quickly go through some of the stuff we did with Bible Hub that you can also do on here. For instance, so we have the story of Cain and Abel up again, Genesis chapter 4, that we selected from here. And this is the translation. They have fewer translation options. Still no NRSV. And then over here, I'm going to ignore the notes for a second. We're going to look at Bible C, so you can do the same thing where you choose to parallel two different versions. So we've got the man was intimate with his wife versus now the man had relations with his wife. So we've got two English versions, which is you choose one of them. And then you've got the Hebrew. So this is one reason I use Bible Hub at all, even though this has, so like for this you hover over the Hebrew over here, and if you look way down here, it gives you the definition. See? And I do love that you can either hover over the Hebrew, or you can choose to, when you have this Hebrew tab open on this side, you can choose to hover. You could say, okay, which of these many Hebrew words I don't know was intimate with, and it highlights it over here, and it's yod, and then like I said, it shows you the verb below, which is great. So there's your basic definition of all, like yod in general, and you can do Strong search. So again, that Strong's Concordance. Do the Strong search if you want to do what we were doing earlier, where we choose where we look at every single use of this word in the Bible. So, oh my gosh, 872 results. So this word for know is even more common than that word for guard. And you can choose, and I do like this, you can choose to look at them in order. So it starts with the very first use of know, or you can do relevance. I'm not quite sure myself. I bet they tell you somewhere how they decide what the most relevant uses are, but that's there, so that's nice. So that's the strong search where, what I did was I double clicked on this. That's how I did the strong search. And then a word study shows you what Bible Hub did, where it doesn't just give you that basic definition, but it goes into a little more detail. It tells you where it comes from etymologically. Again, that might not mean much to some of you. That's totally fine. It tells you it's a verb. It tells you, again, so how often it's used, things like that. So that's that. Again, I kind of like Bible Hub has even more going on because it shows that Brown-Drivers-Briggs stuff. So I appreciate that. Maps. Ooh, see, I've never looked at these. These could be fun. So you could look at some maps. So yeah, that's what you got with Lumina. Here is the best part. That this is what Lumina has that Bible Hub does not. This is my favorite part about Lumina, is the notes section. Net notes. There's also, you can, if you log in, you can make notes yourself, like for yourself, so that's nice. Constable's notes, McLaren, so these I don't tend to look at, but like if you want more commentary and you're willing to sift through some stuff that of varying sort of theological bent and all of that, you got that. But I love the net notes. This is my favorite. So because they have, if it starts with TN, that means it's a translator's note, and it's going to tell you something about the Hebrew that you might not know if you don't know Hebrew, right? So again, now the man was intimate with his wife Eve. If you follow the footnote there, it tells you that in Hebrew, it literally, like it, what's in quotes is what it sort of more literally says in Hebrew, which is just the man knew, a frequent euphemism for sex, right? Here, verse 5, so the footnotes here, it explains why she names him Cain, because if you don't have a footnote, it's confusing. It explains in more detail than Bible Hub did that the sound of the verb, like it's wordplay stuff, and then that she says, just as the Lord did in Hebrew, with the Lord. Basically, it launches into this long thing that tells you some different ways that translators have chosen to translate this and why, what the reasoning was, and that is so great. It tells you, like it's long, so you'll have to buckle up and be in for some reading if you want all of this. But if you were curious about why different translations have different options, it goes into some great explanation for some of it. And it's the same with what we were looking with, remember? So in verse 4, and the Lord was pleased with, or accepted, or looked upon Abel and his offering, but Cain and his offering he was not pleased or looked upon or whatnot. They'll have a translator's note that explains that sha'ah simply means to gaze at, to have regard for, to look on with favor. The text does not indicate how this was communicated, but it indicates that Cain and Abel knew immediately. So yeah, it does, it's almost like this translator, whoever took these notes, did that work that we did on Bible Hub for you, which is really nice, right? And then if it's SN, it means study note, I think. I'm pretty sure that's what the S stands for. And so it's not something about the Hebrew. It's something about like the context, whether that's cultural context, or in this case, it's telling you, hey, that somewhere else in the Bible, over in the letter to the Hebrews, they talk about Cain and Abel. And so the letter to the Hebrews interprets what happened here as Cain didn't have enough faith, and that's why God doesn't like Cain's gift. So that's one interpretation offered by another biblical author. But again, it doesn't have to be the only one. As we see, the Hebrew is much more sort of general than that. There's lots of other options there. It also tells you fun stuff like the Hebrew, where it says that Cain became very angry. Well, literally, it just says it was hot to Cain. It's a Hebrew idiom that means Cain burned with anger. That's so much fun, right? You wouldn't know that in most translations. So that is why I love Net Bible, and their notes section is so helpful. Again, sometimes I'm not a fan of the notes. Like, I don't always agree with the theology offered. Like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, this is about Jesus, when no, it doesn't have to be about Jesus. But for the most part, if you're just looking for like stuff about the basic Hebrew, this is such a wonderful resource. I am so happy it's free and available to anybody. So yeah, that's sort of the speed run. If instead of using Bible Hub, you want to go like just look at some basic translation notes, it's great. And some of them get more scholarly, like this one, translator, oh gosh, I can't remember what this stands for, the TC, but basically it's letting you know something about different manuscripts that have been found of the Hebrew, that some of them have different things written in them in the Hebrew, and how that complicates things. Stuff you just wouldn't know otherwise. It's really nice. So yeah, that's Lumina. I love it. Okay. Whew. I'm tired of hearing my own voice. I imagine y'all are probably tired too. I feel like that was a lot of information to throw at you, and also we didn't actually do that much. It's just so long because I wanted to provide examples and do my best to make it as clear as possible. Even so, I have no idea if that was coherent, if it was actually helpful to people who don't know Hebrew, Greek, and all of that. So please let me know. I would love feedback. Was this helpful? Did it make sense? Do I need to clarify something? What more do you want to see? What kind of tools do you need in your life? Anything like that, or if you have tools you know of that you like, that you want to let me know about, share all that. I'd love to hear it in the comments, or reaching out to me on social media, whatever. Like I said, next video we're going to get a little more complicated into grammar stuff, especially stuff that's specific to Hebrew and Greek. Those might be separate videos. We'll see. We'll see. Want to keep it short, but just like basics that are helpful to know, even if you don't learn the whole language, type things. But for now, here's what we learned today, right? We learned how to look at different English translations together to sort of see the differences there. We learned how to find some footnotes and commentary, especially on the Net Bible, right? So what other people have said and thought about the text. We learned how to take a word and like search around, like in the Hebrew or the Greek, it works for the Greek as well, to search and see where else in the Bible that word was used, and also what exactly it means and all of that. Flapjack wants to say hello before I get out of here. He's my sweet boy, but he can't go on my laptop. But so yeah, that's what we did today, and hopefully what I'll do in the next video. Please, yeah, let me know what was helpful, what wasn't, what needs clarification, etc. And gosh, I just want people to be able to really enjoy the richness of the Hebrew and the Greek. The Bible is really complicated and so much richer than you'll ever know if you're stuck in only a translated language, you know? So that's it. Bye.